Good morning. It is really good to be back with you. I'm sorry if I have a little lingering cough and sore throat and things like that. But we are on the mend, and it's so good to be back with you. Good morning to all those watching online. It's great to have you with us. And I just wanted to give a little disclaimer about this chair. If you've ever been pregnant before, then you know that some weeks you just have nausea nonstop. Some weeks you tweak your back and you have no idea how you did it. This was one of those weeks. So I'm struggling a little bit to move around, getting closer to the final end date of this little baby coming. So thank you for bearing with me. It does happen to have a similar vibe of my sermon title, which is On the Same Couch. That was not intentional, but I'm going to pretend that everything was intentional. So Justin and I will be celebrating our 10th anniversary this June. And it's hard to believe. I'm sure some of you can resonate. You look back and you're like, man, we were babies back then. Like, how did we make that decision? It's hard to believe that a third of my life has been spent with Justin, and yet it's hard for me to imagine a time when he wasn't in my life. And when I think back over the last 12 years of our relationship, I think of some really high highs and some lower lows, and I think about a lot of the funny little fights that would happen over the years, some of them sillier than others. And I can think of a few off the top of my head that were just really silly in the grand scheme of things. And honestly, I'm not trying to sound extra humble here, but sometimes I look back at the fights and I'm like, did I start every single fight? Like, I'm trying to think of one Justin fight that started. I think it's mostly me. And so, I mean, I'm sure he started some. But when I was thinking back, I'm like, oh, that was me. Okay, let me think of one that's a good example. And so I started thinking of some really silly things, especially during a season when I had pregnancy brain for the first time. And some people say it's a made-up thing. I can promise you it isn't, because I'm already scatterbrained, and it upped it like 10 levels for me. And there were times, I'd misplace really important things like my keys and my cell phone. I do that on a regular basis anyway. But I'd put them in strange places, which is where I call the pregnancy brain goes to. And I'd put, my keys in the fridge, and I'd be looking everywhere for like an hour for them. And I'm like, are you kidding me? How did I put them in here? I'd crack the eggs that I was making for breakfast into the garbage can, put the shells into the bowl. And I'm like, oh, man, I wasted more eggs again. And so there were silly things like that. But one day in particular, I just remember being like, this was the epitome of what I would call pregnancy brain. So ridiculous. I was in the car, and I don't remember what I was thinking, but I just felt the urge. I really have to sneeze. And, in a typical growing up experience, you learn you sneeze into your arm. And, that's probably the safest way to do things. That had been my habit. But for some reason, on this day, I had to sneeze, and I grab Justin's arm. Does anyone know where I'm going with this? I grab his bare arm, bring it right up to my face, and I sneeze the juiciest sneeze into his arm. And, you can imagine me trying to back away from that situation. I have no idea what just came over me. And if somebody came up to you right now and did that to you, you would be so disturbed. And he was disgusted. And it was so hard for me to explain innocently, pregnancy brain, I don't know what to tell you. So he struggled a little bit. He got angry, grossed out. But eventually, that was a pretty silly example of a fight we had. And it fell away pretty quickly. It was a misunderstanding. But there are times we can't get over things as quickly, aren't there? There are times that we've hurt each other with something that we've said unintentionally or intentionally. We've done something to hurt one another. And I have a problem of reacting too quickly to something with Justin and not putting enough thought into what I'm saying in order to cushion whatever I'm trying to say. And you can imagine that doesn't get the best response. And then there's other times that Justin assumes the worst out of my motives, or assumes that, I intentionally was later to something than I said I would be. There have been times when we've grown extra heated with one another in arguments and miscommunication. And I think all of us really just want to be known and understood and loved, regardless of what they are understanding about us. But sometimes it feels like there's this cavern in between what we're feeling and what we're trying to communicate, where we are right now and where we want to be in our relationship. Can anyone relate with this? Does anyone else have a less than perfect marriage or relationship or friendship? Justin and I did a marriage course by Alpha a couple years ago, and they summed up miscommunication or fights in relationships in a really cool way that really stood out to me. They said something like, oftentimes we view ourselves on the opposite side of the coffee table. It's you on your couch, me on mine. But in a relationship, we tend to place ourselves on the opposite sides of each other, against each other, but we're actually on the same team. We're on the same couch. And it's not us against each other, it's us against the opposition that we're facing, the problem that's in front of us. And it's helpful for us to remember that, not just as husband and wife, but as Christians, as humans. It's not us against each other, it's us against the brokenness of the world. Us against the opposition that we'll face in our lives. It's you and me against the darkness that tries so hard to break us apart, that tries to bring disunity and tear down any good thing that God is doing in the world. And maybe you can resonate with that today. Maybe you don't feel like it's a neighbor or a friend that's in opposition to you or trying to break you down. Maybe for you it's an internal battle. Maybe you're listening today and you realize every morning when you wake up, you have to fight against the powers that be in your life. You have to fight against the enemy and the form of darkness and the form of anxiety or depression. You have to fight against the enemy of negative thinking that says, you're not capable of that. How will God ever use you? And maybe it is a person or a group of people or family relationships that you felt oppressed or discouraged by. There's someone in your life putting up a fight against you. You feel misunderstood and you feel powerless to their accusations and their assumptions. And I think we can all agree that, especially in the year 2022, we're facing a lot of opposition in our lives. A year when we're still fighting COVID. A year when we're still fighting against racial injustice. When there's still terrible things happening in the world. I think we can all agree that sometimes we sense the enemy's presence not only in our own lives, but in the lives of our family, and our friends, and our church community, in our city. I think there's times we can almost hear the enemy saying, what makes you think you can rebuild? What makes you think that can be restored? What makes you think there's really any hope at all? And thankfully today we have a powerful example from the Bible. We've been in Nehemiah for the last 3 weeks, and we've learned a lot about this remarkable leader. And he's not a typical leader. He wasn't a priest or a prophet of that day, but he's a great one, and he follows through with the vision God gives him from the very beginning, a restoration for his people and his city. By the time we hit chapter 4, the passage we're focusing on today, we see Nehemiah going from having a burden for these people and for his city. And then we see him approaching the king with boldness and humility and asking for things I can't imagine asking for. And we see him receiving those things. We see him getting these resources and materials to follow through with this vision. And then we see him dealing with opposition and getting all his people on board to rebuild. And finally, today, we see him starting the rebuilding process. And it's been a crazy journey to watch Nehemiah's original vision start to come to fruition. So to give us some context before we jump in, chapter 4 opens with the annoying enemy of the Jews, Sanballat, and his friends hurling insults and threats at Nehemiah and his crew. And as the chapter opens, the Sanballat's response toward Nehemiah gets more intense as the progress continues. The opposition against Nehemiah and the Jews starts growing dramatically from their enemy. And the closer they get to the finish line, the more frightening and discouraging things become for them. And all this is happening, and we see that Nehemiah basically just prays to God and just lets him deal with it. He never gets off track. At this point in the rebuilding process, the road to restoration was still long. It would still take many more days, a lot of more personal sacrifice, time, energy, prayer, tons of teamwork to rebuild this wall to its former glory, to protect the people again. But at the same time, in this stage of the game, they're more within reach of the goal than ever before. The opposition was great, but God will prove himself greater. So this is where we're going to be picking up in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall, and the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. When the Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and the gaps were beginning to close, they were very angry, and all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion in it. So we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. Let's just stop here for a second. Notice that Nehemiah didn't bother with anything his enemies were saying. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't get into a fight. He didn't waste his time. Instead, he went directly to God first. And a few weeks ago, we talked about going to prayer first, making that our first response instead of our last resort. And the quote by Oswald Chambers a couple weeks ago was, we tend to use prayer as a last resort, but God wants it as our first line of defense. Nehemiah is once again giving us the example to take everything to the Lord in prayer. Not to despair, not to quit, not to even defend ourselves, but to go to the one who called us first. And then trust that he's going to have our backs to complete the tasks that he's called us to do. So picking up back in verse 10, but Judah said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing, and there's too much rubbish, so that we are unable to work on the wall. Commentator David Gusick has an interesting take on this section. He points out that at this point in the process, when the wall was half built and the momentum was there, it was getting harder and harder for the Jews to stay encouraged. And maybe you can resonate with that in your own lives. The closer you are to a goal, to what you feel like God is calling you to do, the more opposition you feel like you're facing. And he says that this revelation from the powerful tribe of Judah would have been way more hurtful coming from them. It would have been more discouraging. If they're going to get discouraged, how can the rest of us believe we can actually do it? And maybe in our context today, if pastors, if the leaders are getting discouraged, how can we believe we can do it? David Gusick also likened the rubbish that they would have had to haul away to keep building something new and lasting is similar to our experiences with facing the tasks God gives us. How easy is it to get discouraged by the monotonous work of hauling away the old habits, the old sins that are ineffective, when really we just want to enjoy the process of rebuilding something new and shiny. But it's necessary to our growth to haul away the old. We have to purge ourselves individually and corporately as a church from the rubbish that gets away in the mission of God. That simple sentence, that proclamation of Judah saying we can't do this, is packed with so much of a challenge for us. How do we remain encouraged and motivated when the work still seems so overwhelming? How often is it that we experience the most opposition, the most temptation to give up, the most discouragement when we are actually closer to the goal than ever before? The enemy wants us to stay discouraged. He wants us to get sloppy. He wants us to build a new building on old rubbish because he knows that if we're patient and we persevere and we clear away the old before building the new, that will lead to defeat for him and victory for God. He wants us to stay discouraged. Verse 11 says, and our enemies said, they will not know or see anything before we come upon them and kill them and stop the work. When the Jews who lived near them came, they said to us 10 times, from all the places where they live, they will come up against us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall in open places, I stationed people according to their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. Nehemiah knew that to accomplish the mission of God, it'll take everyone playing their unique role. Not all of us are worship leaders or good at hospitality. Not all of us are great with kids or aware of the needs of our community. But if we, like the Jews in this story, can come together and lift up our talents and the different tasks that God has called us to do, we'll be able to work together and accomplish something so much more powerful and lasting than if we try to do it on our own. In verse 14, after I looked over these things, I stood up and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your kin, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. No matter what opposition you're facing, whether that's internal or with a family member who doesn't value you or a friend who is in conflict with you, maybe you're looking at it from a church perspective and you're thinking the mission of rebuilding is too big, is too hard. The enemy feels stronger than us. No matter if what you're feeling is from a corporate perspective or a personal perspective, you have to remember the goal. The reason it's fighting for people to know Jesus. It's paving a way of hope for our community. And if we lose sight of who we are fighting for, then the enemy, the opposition, has already won. Nehemiah says, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. And fight for your kin, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And I think that's the kind of verse we should wake up reciting every morning when we get out of bed. This is why I work. This is why I fight. This is why I hope. Because I believe in making an impact in the world for Jesus. It's about bringing hope to the hopeless, no matter how much opposition I seem to be having. In verse 15, when our enemies heard that their plot was known to us and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the work on the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held spears, bows, shields, and body armor. And the leaders posted themselves behind the whole house of Judah, who were building the wall. The burden bearers carried the loads in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand, and with the other held a weapon. And each of the builders had his sword strapped on his side while he built. Nehemiah knew what we should all know at this point. We have to carry a weapon of defense against the opposition we face in one hand, and a tool to build something new in the other. It's not enough to just survive and fight. We must continue on in progress toward the goal, the mission that God has called us to do. How powerful is that imagery? Carrying the mental, spiritual weapon of my identity in Christ, my security in him. Carrying the weapon of prayer to defend myself against discouragement and fear, to defend others from the same thing. And then on the other hand, I carry creativity and encouragement to pass on to the people around me. I carry diligence and hard work and perseverance to help build something new. We have to carry both. We have to be on guard and ready to not only fight, but to move forward and to ultimately see the dreams and visions God has called us to, has given us, come to fruition. Verse 18, the man who sounded the trumpet was beside me, and I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread out, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Rally to us whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet. Our God will fight for us. This is our call to unity. We rally together. We can't do it on our own. We need each other, and we have to be the ones to remind ourselves of that truth, that we aren't alone in our mess, in the brokenness of the world, in the hopelessness of the opposition we face, but that our God will fight for us. No matter the distance between us on a normal week, no matter the different career paths each of us have, if we're retired or not retired, no matter what our personal giftings are and our personal callings are, we have to rally back together every Sunday to worship God together, to praise him for what he's doing. And we have to rally every week together as small groups to encourage one another and support each other. And we have to rally as much as we can to bring hope to the community, to serve the community. When we're together, we're stronger, and we're reaffirmed of the truth that we can do all things through Christ who gives us strength, and that God will fight for us. Verse 21 to the end of the passage says this, so we labored at the work, and half of them held spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at the time, let every man and the servant pass the night inside Jerusalem. so that they may be on guard by us day and may labor by night. So neither I nor my brothers nor my servants nor the men on the guard who followed me ever took off their clothes. Each kept his weapon in his right hand. When I read the total of this passage, there's two things that stand out to me. That the greatest gifts Nehemiah had, the greatest gifts that we have, other than salvation, is prayer and people. The two biggest blessings we can have in this life is communication with God through prayer, a relationship with God. And then we also have this privilege of having the support, the accountability, the friendship with the people of God. And we don't always live like it, but God's design for the church was mutual edification and unity. His design for the church with the capital C was for us to bear one another's burdens, to not get discouraged because we have teammates, we have family on this journey, and we're never alone. So the solution to the opposition we face in 2022, the solution to the mission that God is calling us to in 2022 is prayer and people. It's communication and community. It's holy communion with God and communion with one another. I don't know what opposition you're going to face this year or this month or even this week. It might be the physical battle with the enemy of cancer. It might be the mental battle with the enemy of anxiety. It might be the social battle of loneliness and friendship loss. It might be the test results you didn't want to receive, the academics you didn't achieve, the people you couldn't please. It might be the discouragement in the rebuilding process of our church. It might be the enemy whispering lies to you that you're not good enough. It might feel like COVID's going to prevail for yet another year, and we're all sick of it. I don't know what opposition each of you will face, but I do know this. The answer is communion with God and communion with others. Because we're reminded time and time again in the Bible that we can't do it on our own. We need each other. In this passage particularly, we're reminded yet again that the solution to our problems, to fighting the enemy, to opposing the darkness, to achieving the mission God has set before us, individually and corporately, is resting in prayer and trusting in the people that God has given us, like Nehemiah did. In January 2017, Justin and I had come off of a full year of touring with our band, and we were exhausted. We were financially depleted 100%, but we were also emotionally, spiritually, socially depleted as well. It was a good year. We learned a lot. We saw a lot. We met a lot of great people. We made a lot of great memories. But if you've ever traveled full time or you've owned your own business and you've been responsible for putting food on the table for yourself and for others, there's a heavy burden to carry with that. And I'm not somebody who craves security and comfort. I'm actually somebody who craves probably the opposite of that: freedom, independence, adventure. You can ask my husband. So life on the road is kind of catered to my lifestyle. I love that. But this time was different. I came back just so worn down. I missed people. I missed community. I missed investing in the same people over and over again and seeing, even though it might be small, the impact of living for Jesus faithfully with the people around you. On the road, you meet dozens of new people every day. You have great conversations. You entertain. You pray. And you do have the chance to help change someone's life. But there's no follow-up. It's not really sustainable. And honestly, it can be really lonely. So in January 2017, Justin and I chose to come off the road for a little bit, build back our finances, ask God for what he had planned next. So we moved in with my grandparents in North Chili for 6 months, picked up odd jobs, and just used that time to rebuild ourselves individually and our relationship because we had just been so worn down. And most notably during that time is that I got involved in a small group in our community led by one of my closest friends. And it was unlike any small group I had ever been a part of before. It was rigorous. There was accountability, a sharp start and end time, verses to memorize each week, homework to do. We had prayer partners and did service projects. And it was honestly one of the most enriching seasons of my life. And that year in 2017, I chose the word expectation as my word of the year. And God blew me away with what he blessed me with. And that 6 months spent in solid community, I learned to expect good things from God again. I learned to trust him again with my whole heart. And through that community, I was reminded of my purpose and importance. And that led to growth in so many other areas as well. Doors opened for Justin and I to become pastors in Brockville. And we were blessed with the discovery of being pregnant for the first time with our little boy. You see, we often talk about difficult seasons of waiting. And then we often talk about seasons of victory on the other side. But we don't always talk about the seasons of grit and obedience in between. We don't always see what God is doing in those seasons, who he's shaping us to be in those moments of small group discussion. In those moments of reading the Bible consistently, praying and expecting God to speak. If I didn't have community during that time, I don't know what I would have done. The support, the prayer, the advice, the encouragement, the challenges, they helped me get through a season of dryness and loneliness, exhaustion, and honestly sometimes despair. It wasn't easy to work through all of that, to rely and trust in community that much, but it was worth it to clear the rubble away and rebuild. What I've learned over the years is that my life is so much more dull without people in it. It's less invigorating and life-giving. It's less difficult and challenging, but it's less joy-filled and support-filled. Doing life without community is limiting to our growth and our wholeness as people. It limits what God can do through us. The good news about the story of Nehemiah is that the walls do get built, and they're lasting. They're filled with the memory of God's faithfulness and the hope he brings his people. You can still see those walls today. What are you building? What are we building as a church? And will we be able to see it decades from now? Will we be able to say that because of City Hope's faithfulness to God, I am reminded of God's faithfulness? I can be encouraged that whatever challenge we're going to face, we can do it again. If Nehemiah helped rebuild that city, don't you think we can help rebuild ours? Don't you think that God can breathe new breath into the lungs of the city of Rochester? Into each individual person, into you, into me. Do you believe that he's not done working here? God is calling us to be a part of the rebuilding, the restoring, the renewing. But we have to be willing to say yes. And part of that saying yes is saying yes to community, to small groups, to investing in people, to mentoring people. As we rebuild in one hand and we use our talents and our time and our energy and our money, in the other hand, we have to be protecting what we're building. And the only way we can really protect ourselves and what we are building is by resting in prayer and trusting in the people God has given us. I can't do it without you, and you can't do it without me. So what do? I want to challenge each of us, if we haven't already, to join a small group. There's no time like the present, and I promise it'll be worth it. And I want to challenge you, if you haven't jumped on board with this month of prayer. I know we're toward the end of January now, as we pray for the needs of the people we know in our community, and we pray for the vision that God is giving us. Imagine what would happen if we truly invested in the people around us, if we truly trusted them and they could trust us. Imagine if we went to God in prayer first. If we carried protection in one hand and passion in the other. Imagine if we continued to rebuild our church. If we determined ourselves to rebuild this beautiful city that God has blessed us with. Imagine the hope that would permeate this region. Imagine the enemy realizing that there are no triumphs that await him here at City Hope. That there will be no victories for him in your home or in the town of Gates, but that God will continue to fight for us as we trust in him. In marriage, when we face opposition, we have to fight our way through something challenging together on the same couch. But we come out stronger. It's the same in every area of our lives. We might be facing opposition in our personal lives or in our church community or in our city, but we will come out stronger. As we leave today, may we be reminded that God isn't calling us to do the rebuilding by ourselves. He's telling us to pray and to trust in him, and he's telling us to unite together because we're truly stronger that way.